And hello and welcome to The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. I'm Annette Young, filling in for François Picard, who's on a badly needed vacation. Now, normally my guests would be chewing the fat over this week's headlines, but not today, thanks to the US in an extraordinary move launching those airstrikes in Syria in reprisal for that deadly chemical weapons attack earlier this week by Syrian strongman Bashar al-Assad. Now, as I've been saying, it's a stark reversal from the president's formerly standoff approach to the six-year-old civil war. Now, here in the studio to discuss with me the implications is Christopher Dickey, the foreign editor of the Daily Beast. Hello again. Vivian Walt, a contributor to Time magazine. Hello, Vivian.
Hello.
Elena Gabrielian, a RFI journalist, and France 24's very own chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons. But before we start these discussions, these airstrikes, following 2 days of intense diplomatic activity at the United Nations, as the US, Britain and France sought support for a Security Council draft resolution. They were demanding that Syria hand over intelligence on its air operations, including any flight plans produced on the day of the chemical attack. Catherine Viette takes a closer look at the breakdown as a result in diplomacy.
Using words like horrific, atrocious, barbaric, diplomats wasted no time in condemning Tuesday's deadly chemical attack in Syria. On Thursday, the U.S. ambassador to the UN warned the U.S. was willing to act alone if no progress was made.
When the United Nations consistently fails in its duty to act collectively, there are times in the life of states that we are compelled to take our own action.
At the UN, France, the US, and the UK set to work drafting a resolution that called for an investigation, a move strongly objected to by Syria and its main ally, Russia.
In our understanding, Security Council cannot accept a resolution blaming everything on Assad without having any results of any investigation. It will be simply unfair in terms of international law and incorrect.
Fearing a Russian veto, a vote on the resolution was postponed, causing frustration.
It is a scandal that no UN Security Council resolution materialized, and those who oppose it must consider what responsibility they bear.
While the diplomats squabbled, U.S. President Donald Trump took action. It seems the images of gassed children were the tipping point. Once wary of pulling the U.S. into the Syrian conflict, in a stunning about-face, Trump ordered a series of airstrikes, which he said would prevent and deter further atrocities.
Christopher, the big question on everybody's lips today is, did President Trump have the legal authority to carry out these airstrikes?
Yeah, sure, he had the legal authority to do this much. If it were going to be any kind of protracted engagement, and there would be all kinds of questions about whether Congress would have to authorize it. But this much he can do. And I think people forget how often the United States, under very many different presidents, has carried out these kinds of actions, including cruise missile attacks. I was actually on the receiving end of several of them in Iraq and Libya and lots of places. And almost always those were carried out without congressional authorization.
But it's created a lot of anger among some in Congress who feel that they should have been notified beforehand.
Seems like background noise to me. I mean, I think, you know, it's really a red herring, I would say, as the expression goes. As Chris says, it's not that often that you get congressional approval. And it was somewhat unusual that Obama insisted on it back in 2013. When he decided not to strike her. He didn't want to do it, and he basically used Congress as a way to back out. But in fact, you know, Trump is the commander-in-chief, and he certainly can send Tomahawk missiles to strike Syria.
Rob, some would say, however, that Congress in recent years has become rather weak and desensitised to the violence that's been going on in Syria.
Trump has become desensitized.
Congress.
Congress. Oh, you know, No, I don't think so particularly. I mean, there's nothing really on the evidence that we've seen over the last few months to suggest that, I don't think. And that, I completely agree that the reaction from Congress is background noise rather than anything else at the moment. There are some dissenting voices, but by and large they've been in a very small minority. Congress seems to be solidly, by and large, behind President Trump on this. So I think to read too much into this at this stage would be a mistake.
Elena, obviously the big question also is, what will Moscow do next?
Well, you know, the Russians' reaction was predictable, we can say, because they condemned these airstrikes, but still Donald Trump is unpredictable for Moscow. Even today in the morning, I read some reactions in Russian press where journalists write, finally, in Moscow, we understand who is the man who came to the power in White House. But even I think that after these airstrikes, even in Europe and in Russia, we don't understand really who is Donald Trump. In Russia, we underlined that it was quite emotional decision, analyzing his speech where Donald Trump, he was talking about this emotional aspect, but he underlined the same argument as, for example, for the operation against ISIS. He talked about the national security of United States, even if it's not the same scale of operation, but the argument is about national security. In Russia soon we will have the visit of Rex Tillerson, the 11th of April. I don't know if this visit will be held on, but anyway, we will see in which way this crisis would be managed by the head of diplomacy of the United States, who would be for the first time received in Moscow as the head of diplomatic department of American.
Christopher, is there much that Russia can actually really do?
Oh yeah, there are a lot of things that Russia can do. One thing it's going to do right away is strengthen the air defenses of Syria so that it's harder to carry out these kinds of attacks in the future. I think the danger here, though, is essentially an emotional and political one for Putin. He has invested a lot of his prestige in Syria to have a situation where the Americans start to take out Syrian installations with apparent impunity, while the Russians are left either just warned and told to get out of the way or seen to be impotent. That's very difficult for Putin. Yeah. But the question, I think, is not really, at this point, what is Russia going to do? It's what the hell is the United States going to do? I mean, what is the next step for Washington, for Trump? Where is this supposed to go? It isn't clear at all that this is part of a coherent policy. This is a very quick reaction to show, once again, to show you're not impotent, to show that you're tough, to show that you will act.
Obama.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I agree with the second part of what you said. I'm not so sure about the first part. I think the problem for Russia at the moment is that Putin, having invested so much of his own prestige in Syria, is left in the position of looking impotent.
Well, yeah.
And it's possible, of course, to improve to a degree the air defense systems of Syria, but only to a degree. If you go too far, you find yourself locked into a conflict with Israel as well. And I'm not sure the Russians really want to go down that path. And there's only a limited amount you can do with your air defenses against the sort of munitions that the United States has at its disposal, if it's really determined. Which brings us to the second part of what you're saying, where I completely agree. There doesn't seem to be a strategy. Nobody seems to have thought beyond stage one. What happens next? What if Assad does something equally terrible tomorrow? What are you going to do?
Well, I think that's the thing. And I think that the big question is, what exactly was the motivation of Assad in the chemical attack? And, you know, did he actually play Trump in a way? Because given that he can keep on launching chemical attacks, this means that the US has to respond to each one, and each counterattack has to be stronger than the one before. And before you know it, the US is in a war that it swore it would not get into. So I think that there are a lot of open questions about
but there was a very different message coming out of Washington earlier in the week, which was that, you know, somewhat ambivalent about the removal of Assad, and then next thing we know, Assad carried out this chemical attack. Do you think the two things are actually linked, Vivian?
I think it was certainly, I mean, who on earth knows what goes on inside the brain of Bashar Assad? But it does seem to have been, in some ways, a test of Trump to see, you know, is he Obama too, or is he actually going to respond to this?
Rob, you're going to say something?
Well, no, coming so soon after Donald Trump's statement earlier on in the week that, as far as he was concerned, Bashar al-Assad's not the main problem. The main problem is dealing with the Islamic State organization. We can live with Assad. Perhaps it's a reaction to that, an opportunity that he took to exploit the situation, to push things a little bit further. But the point I'd like to make is a slightly different one from that. The problem for the United States is, I think Donald Trump and everybody around him have pretty much come to the conclusion that Russia was essential to the solution of the problem in Syria. You can't do without it. And that the administration, the regime, the infrastructure that goes with the regime are essential to ensuring that there is some sort of solution after the war is over. It looks all of a sudden as if, you know, everything, you know, is being thrown out of the window. It's not at all clear where he wants to go from here.
Elena?
Actually, we talked about the prestige of Vladimir Putin, of Russia generally in the Syrian conflict. This airstrike really undermined this reputation of Vladimir Putin, because Russia deployed this system of intercepting of missiles and cruise missiles. So why Russia didn't use this
to defend its own
system?
aircraft.
So it was, but until now, Russia let understand all the world that Moscow is ready to use this system if Assad is struck by Americans, so Russia didn't use. Does it mean that Moscow gave a tacit consent to this strike?
Well,
it's one of the open questions.
The Russians on the ground were contacted beforehand, weren't they? I mean, there was no call made to Moscow, but those in the area itself.
Yes, Russian forces, Russia was warned about this operation, and well, some of sources are talking about 2 hours after operation was launched.
Remember that the S-400 missile defense system that the Russians introduced was introduced in the wake of the attack by the Turkish aircraft on a Russian aircraft, which brought it down. It was a response to that to ensure the protection of Russian forces in Syria, not a complete guarantee to Syrian air forces that they will be protected by the Russian installations, as far as I understood it, anyway.
Christopher, what do you think the impact's going to be on US-Russian relations, especially given that Rex Tillerson is heading in the direction of Moscow next week?
Well, I think it's going to be very negative. I think that Putin can't be seen to bend on this one. He's going to have to say, I strongly support Assad. Whether behind the scenes he said, well, you know, I'd like to get rid of that SOB myself, but what can we do? That he may say. They may have that kind of conversation. But at the end of the day, Russia is invested in Assad, and they can't just walk away from him. They can't walk away from that triumvirate of Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah that basically make the Assad government viable at this point in the face of a revolution. So a multifaceted revolution. So I think that he's not going to be able to give very much. You know, the Russians, and you correct me on this, but my sense is the Russians thought Tillerson would be their old friend from the oil days.
They thought they had their man in the State Department.
Yeah, they thought that he was going to be coming next week, and they were going to talk about ending the Cold War that was begun, they say, that was begun by the United States, in fact was begun by them when they annexed Crimea and started a war in Ukraine. But they thought that's what they'd be talking about next week. Now, they're going to be talking about Syria and probably precious little else.
I mean, I just wonder, picking up on Chris's point, whether Russia is completely committed to Assad the person or to the regime. I think Iran is committed to Assad, the person, much more than Moscow is. I think the Russians are prepared to sort of maneuver a little bit with the Americans and see whether they can find common ground on finding a way to preserve the regime, but perhaps letting Assad slip away.
Most importantly, preserving the right to maintain that naval port in Tartus, which of course is the bottom line.
Well, not just the port. I mean, Syria is their bridgehead into the Middle East. This has given them a presence in the Middle East like they haven't seen since probably the 50s or early 60s.
I think that it is important also to remind that Russia suspended the agreement which was signed with Americans in 2015 to avoid some confrontation or in-flight incidents, right, of these two forces, Russian and Americans. It was suspended, so that it means that the two parts have no obligation to warn about their actions in Syria. So the risk.
How dumb is that on the part of the Russians?
But the confrontation, the risk of confrontation is really increased, and today all Russian experts were concerned about that this agreement was suspended. So. At the same time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia told that he was disappointed and he condemned this action. But he told the situation is not irreversible. So does it mean that maybe next week...
Yeah, it did seem like the statements were very guarded. It's not like they really responded with great outrage.
They were guarded, but what was really interesting was when Tillerson gave a briefing after the attack, the language he used about Russia was violent language.
Very strong.
He said, basically, you know, Russia and the United States put together this agreement in 2013 to get rid of chemical weapons. It was supposedly done, and any sort of the policing of that basically was Russia's responsibility. Yeah. And he said either they were complicit in the attack, the chemical weapons attack, or they were incompetent. Now, that's not the kind of language that Vladimir Putin likes.
Rex Tillerson, who recently before coming to his post, he was presented like a very friendly, Putin-friendly diplomat.
Putin gave him an award, gave him a...
Yes, of course.
I think it's like everything associated with the Trump administration. From one minute to the next, you don't know how things are going to turn out. Look,
as I told, that is unpredictable, even for Moscow.
At this point, we're going to have to press the pause button. Do stay with us, because we'll be back with the second part of The World This Week.